Your relationships are patterns. This has been a recurring theme in my life. I realized actually quite some time ago that there were certain patterns showing up in the relationships I had. Certain familiar patterns from childhood. Oftentimes patterns of settling in a relationship that felt comfortable enough, familiar enough, but quite codependent. And also oftentimes not respecting that person I was with. And other patterns where there might have been a deep physical, chemical attraction to a person, but there kind of there wasn't much else there. And I would notice myself becoming somewhat, in a way, addicted to that person, addicted to the idea of what they might bring me, give me, how they might fulfill me. And in those other relationships where I was settling, I felt myself not really respecting the person I was with, not really liking that much about them. However, they were comfortable and they felt safe enough, like they wouldn't leave me. So it felt like a safe attachment, albeit very unfulfilling attachment. And I wasn't being honest with myself in those relationships, those past relationships, where I felt very in the relationship, but also not truly in it, kind of half there, half not there. There on the surface, but not there in my heart and my soul, because I knew I really wanted more, and that this wasn't a relationship for me ultimately. And I did have the wisdom to eventually leave those relationships that had that settling pattern. And then also those relationships that often ended in heartbreak. They were kind of almost the polar opposite of those settling type relationships. There was an intense amount of attraction in those, I would call them more chemically addictive relationships. And there was a real seeking and a belief that I really loved the person. But ultimately, I discovered that wasn't true. When those relationships left me, I discovered that ultimately I was quite grateful for that relationship to have ended, however painful it was at the time, because there was a part of my ego, part of my codependency that was really latching out, seeking, having these feelers out. Some idea was, I was very attached to a particular ideal of what a romantic partner should look like and feel like and act like. And of course, by projecting that onto someone, I was setting myself up right then and there for a lot of disappointment and in some cases betrayal. But the deeper betrayal, and I don't even know if I want to use the word betrayal, but the deeper, because it's always unconscious too, quote unquote betrayal, if you want to use that word, was not first and foremost loving myself, being true to myself. And some of you may not, I'm going to qualify that statement of loving yourself, because there's a lot of ideas of if we really can love ourselves or not, and who are ourselves to love, especially in these spiritual communities that some of us find ourselves in, New Age communities as well. Who is this self that we can love and not love and abandon and reject and neglect and ignore? But the truth is, there is an energy within us, a childish energy that was deeply wounded in our early experiences for a lot of us, especially those of us who have codependent personality traits now and have habits or patterns of chasing or avoiding. There's that anxious attachment style that we know of. There's that avoidant attachment style. I think I just described the anxious attachment style that I had with a few of my exes. That needing, searching, trying to get something outside of myself in a way to fill a hole, a felt hole within, to fill up some kind of idealized version of what I thought a partner, my partner, should look like, act like, feel like. And there's also the disorganized attachment style too. I've noticed myself having the avoidant attachment style as well as the anxious attachment style, which would more likely qualify as the disorganized, ultimately disorganized attachment style, which tends to be flipping between both patterns and strategies at times through different times in our lives, whichever one feels most visceral for the moment. But there have been times where I've really just wanted to cut off almost all contact from the world and from people and just really preserve and protect myself. And I would actively push people away, be kind of cold and distant, withholding of affection. And mainly I was withholding that affection from myself first and foremost, which is why we can't help but project what we're not giving to ourselves onto others, looking for them to quote unquote give us what we feel like we are lacking, what we feel like we didn't get. And a lot of us didn't get that unconditional love in childhood. It was very conditional. I think narcissistic and codependent parenting dynamics especially create that in children, either one or the other. Narcissism or codependency, that codependent part who felt so unloved and not enough, or at times maybe too much, really wasn't seen in childhood, and oftentimes was actively punished for showing its truer self, its more authentic self, for sometimes being playful, expressing certain parts of its identity that weren't welcome by the adult figures in the household, whether they were more overtly discouraged and punished or more covertly just discouraged, implied discouragement. There still was that message of it's not safe and it's not okay to be who you truly are, to be your authentic self. And it didn't feel safe to touch base with who we really are. We learned that if we wanted to stay in the good graces of the adults in the household, the people in power, which as children, our survival is directly dependent on these adult figures, at least providing for us materially and caring for us to some level, even if it's not an emotional level. A lot of times just the physical needs were met, and in some cases not even that, but the emotional needs of the children, these children, were gravely neglected and oftentimes made into a problem. Lots of children like myself and teens were maybe taken to a psychiatrist and just given some pills to take so they would be more toned down, more in line with what the adults wanted and expected, showing less individuality and personality and simply acting like that good girl, right? Good girl or good boy. There's a real wound there. And if we haven't taken the time to be with ourselves, the grace to be with ourselves and give that beautiful child the loving care and attention that it really needs and wants from us, then of course we're going to be projecting that the pain of that child, the unresolved, the unmet hurt, the unseen, the unlovingly seen and acknowledged visceral pain of that inner child. We're going to be projecting that all out into the world and all of our relationships. And it acts the most poignant, I think, or sometimes most painful in romantic relationships or relationships that we hope will become romantic. But it also happens in our daily lives too, sometimes with coworkers and bosses. That authority dynamic can be a very challenging one for a lot of people, because perhaps there was a lot of authority in their house that had to be obeyed, or else your own survival was in jeopardy, felt like it was in jeopardy, even if it may not have been. It becomes such a pattern to make ourselves smaller, make ourselves less individual, less ourselves, authentic, true. It becomes so easy to do that, to dim our light, and to play into these grooved kind of categories and patterns and expectations that we feel others have of us, to act a certain way in our daily lives, in relationship with them, to behave a certain way, to please them. A lot of women have that people pleaser, codependent personality, as I've had. And a lot of men have that nice guy, which is the same as the female people pleaser, just the male version of it. The nice guy identity, overly nice, overly obedient and ready to help and fix for others, or to be an emotional, I want to use the word punching bag, but I'm not sure if that's quite the right word. That sounds a little too forceful, but an emotional blanket in a way for the challenges of others. It's like, I'm here. I'm very in tune with emotion and very empathetic and compassionate. You can lay all of your woes on me. And then the hope for the empathic, codependent, nice guy or people-pleasing girl, woman in this scenario is that if they're really nice to everyone, if they're really there and caring and always showing up in this compassionate way, being needless themselves, and just being there to listen and caretake for others all the time, then you won't be able to judge me or reject me. You'll like me, you'll accept me, you'll think well of me, because it feels too scary for that inner child, that codependent inner child that's deeply wounded and has never healed. It feels too scary to not be liked, to not be seen as good, to not be seen as needless, desireless in its own. It felt safe to just be there in this role, in this capacity, always catering to others' difficulties and challenges and emotional upsets, to be the person that they would always go to, people in distress, oftentimes our own family members or our partners or friends. You might be that person in your friend group, the one that people count on to be there for them and to always not need anything yourself or have really a position truly of your own. It's the chameleon type of skin suit, the chameleon identity, where you're constantly molding yourself to the environment, tuning into the environment, always aware of the environment and how people are acting and moving and feeling in the environment, which you may have seen as somewhat of a superpower. But there is definitely a very dark shadow side to this so-called superpower. And that comes at the expense of yourself, your own needs, your own deeper, truer, authentic values, your light, your ability to shine as big and as bright as you want to, as you have the capacity to, versus constantly contorting yourself so you will fit with others and not ruffle anyone's feathers. And so you'll always be that easy, soothing presence, and everyone will feel at ease with you. But oftentimes people can feel too, even through that, even if they come to you and they rely on you, they may not really deeply respect you, because on some deeper level that they're likely not conscious of, they sense that you're not being true to yourself, that you're not being authentic with yourself. So oftentimes those relationships always crumble, always fall apart at some point, because it's exhausting. It's utterly exhausting. Ignoring yourself, ignoring your own needs, not being true to your own values, and constantly contorting yourself and turning yourself into a chameleon to please others, to keep them comfortable around you, to keep yourself always likable and maybe seeming like the sage of the group. But it's not deeply and truly wise to always be there catering to others, supporting others at the expense of yourself, at the expense of coming home to yourself and loving yourself. And loving yourself really just means being authentic to yourself. So of course, the idea of loving yourself is, in the spiritual community, somewhat controversial, or who can say if we can love ourselves, like what is ourselves that we're loving, but kind of leaving all that aside, all of the nuances of words, because words are inherently limiting. They don't really do what we're speaking about and pointing to true justice, so we work with them the best that we can. But what I mean by loving the self or coming home to the self is becoming your most authentic, brave, courageous self. Having the courage to be there for you and put yourself first, to let go and dissolve those codependent patterns with other people, especially those very toxic relationships, the ones that are very obviously quite toxic, starting with those, by putting up boundaries, loving, compassionate boundaries for yourself, and feeling whatever emotions come up that are aligned and attached to that. I know a lot of codependents, including myself at an earlier stage, I had a lot of guilt and fear and anxiety around having boundaries. And I was very afraid of losing certain relationships and even financial support. And that made it difficult. But I was very glad that I made that braver choice, that more difficult choice at the time, to say no when I really meant no. And I knew that was my truth. And to say yes when I really meant yes. And to know that was my truth. One relationship was particularly hard. It was with a parent who was not in a very good place. Elderly parent, although had grown kind of elderly prematurely, which was very difficult. And because that parent had grown elderly prematurely, I was still fairly young to be faced with such a situation. And I, at the time, didn't really have the resources to do much about it. And I had pressure from other elders in my family network who I hadn't spoken with in a while, because I had put up some loving boundaries for myself after having had a lot of earlier challenges with them in life where I just didn't feel loved and cared for. And all the love that they were there to offer was very conditional. It wasn't even really love. It was more like, we'll accept you if you do everything we want exactly as we want it. kind of thing. And there was also a lot of bullying too in my family network when I was a child as well. I was the different one, the sort of more sensitive, deep thinking one, the one who wrote poetry and sang, the one who cared about animals and preserving and protecting their spirits and lives, not harming them just to harm them. And the rest of my family felt and thought very differently from the way that I did. And that was apparent from a young age. So it helped as a young adult to begin to individuate and really not have much contact with them. And then finally, when I did have contact with them, it was much later in life. Well, not much later. I guess about 10 years-ish. A little bit later in life. I was still pretty young, still a young adult. But it was because they wanted me to take full responsibility for an aging parent that at the time I wasn't prepared to take full responsibility for. And that was my truth. And I had to honor that, and it was extremely painful. And they were very critical and mean about it. And I held more of a presence in the moment because that's all I could really do. And I did feel a lot of guilt and shame and deep sadness about not being able to do more for this parent who was aging prematurely and having a lot of difficulties. And she had had a lot of psychological difficulties as well that had been running her life for a long time and had a lot of unmet, really very much unmet, unprocessed depression, anxiety, anger, insecurities. And I knew that if I had been in a different position with a lot more support, or even a little more support maybe, and a little older and wiser, I would have done more. Just because despite everything, I did still care about this person, despite the pain and the harm that happened early on in life. And I wanted to do the best I could, but I knew I didn't have that to give at the time. And I really had to set a boundary, and I think that was my first time setting a really important boundary that ended up protecting my energy, but also leaving me having to feel a lot of grief and a lot of anxiety and worthlessness and deep sadness and powerlessness. I felt very powerless at that time and defective. Like if I had done something different, I could have saved this person. If I had chosen different paths, if I hadn't been so me, if I hadn't been so unique in a way in comparison to my family, family of origin, the different one, the more sensitive one. But it ultimately wasn't my responsibility to take responsibility for this other family member. This was her path in life. It's not necessarily your responsibility to take responsibility for others. Obviously, if we have a child, so this is the one addendum to that. If we have a child, if we're a parent, right, we've given birth, procreated a child, or we are a step parent also, then we have certain responsibilities to our children, of course. That goes without saying. That's different. But for others in our life, even if they're family, and if there are adult children too, they're fully grown, that's also different. But children, of course, who are still children, teenagers and children, we are responsible for their care and their guidance. But other than that, it wouldn't serve a lot of codependents like myself, who have that wound, often from having a narcissistic parent in their life, or codependent parent, or both, or whatever amalgam of that, whatever setup happened there. It doesn't serve you to always be putting yourself in a position where you feel responsible for everyone around you, where it's always your job to make sure everyone's okay, everyone's stable enough and has all their needs met. That is a lot to put on any one person's shoulders, especially a person who hasn't lifted their own shoulders up, metaphorically speaking, hasn't done the inner work that would actually make them even have the ability to truly, if they chose to, authentically chose to show up for another family member that wasn't their child or friend or coworker, colleague, in a way of taking a lot of responsibility for that person. It's important to know what's my stuff and what's your stuff, and to not be always feeling out and taking up other people's stuff, other people's psychological, unhealed energies, and feeling like it's our job to fix and to heal and to smooth it over and make it better for them, to always pacify them. In a lot of cases, you might even be robbing that other person of the opportunity to do that for themselves, to go within, because they become oftentimes very dependent on you to make them feel better, to soothe them, to always be there at their whim, basically, to soften whatever emotional chaos may be happening within them. And at the same time that you're so busy doing all that, you're distracted from yourself. You're distracted from healing the emotional chaos within you, from becoming present with your inner child, from finding the right supports for you. And that varies for each person. Some people it may be somatic meditation. For others it may be quantum type meditations. For still others it may be plant medicine. For others it may be a really just awesome, trusted, incredible therapist. For some it may be journaling and just sitting and allowing yourself to cry and deeply feel that bravery, that courage of being that compassionate witness, that compassionate adult figure, wise, loving, kind adult figure that your inner child never had in childhood. To do that for yourself now, to do that for that hurting place now, is an incredible gift. And it will leave you feeling more strong and resilient and capable of bravely and authentically moving through this world with real courage and true insight and conviction on what you want for yourself. And you'll be able to just automatically put in place healthy, strong boundaries. And the shame, the more that you begin to put up those healthy, strong, loving boundaries for yourself, the more that any guilt about putting them up in the first place, or even shame, will dissipate and become a lot weaker, progressively weaker and weaker. You'll be able to see through it and not react just because you have a gut level emotion welling up. You'll be able to see and feel that emotion and let it move through you without having to act on that emotion, that uncomfortable, perhaps guilty emotion about setting a boundary. Oh no, I set a boundary. Oh, no, I take it back. No, you don't take it back. You stand firm in your boundary and you feel whatever uncomfortable emotions come up with setting that very important boundary for yourself, because that is a true act of love for you. And until you come home to yourself and set healthy boundaries and live in that for a while, you don't really have the capacity to know what you really want and what you're here to truly do and who you're here to truly serve. And you won't be able to truly do what you truly want to do in the world in a healthy, regulated, emotionally regulated way that deeply serves both yourself and others, and consciousness at large. It's a beautiful thing to want to help others. It's a beautiful thing to have a big heart. But it's really important that you help others if that's what you really want to do in life, and that you have this big compassionate heart, that you do that with a well-regulated nervous system, and that you're authentic to yourself, and that you have healthy, loving boundaries in place, and that you've created secure attachments in your life for yourself. You have to embody what you want to see in the world first, before you'll start to see more and more of it, and before you can deeply serve, truly serve in the ways that you want to, and attract people in your life who will really feel like kindred spirits and will absolutely respect your boundaries, and that you'll be able to have deep, intuitive, kind, compassionate, real conversations without blow-ups and big reactions, but real, genuine, grounded, mature listening and calmness and care. And maybe it won't always be calm. Maybe there'll still be some little storms. That's going to happen too. But there'll be that groundedness. There'll be that ability to consciously discuss hard things and consciously see through those unconscious parts, those unconscious resistances, those spaces where we've been too attached to things that aren't serving us, that are keeping us in these old, egoic, familiar patterns of stagnation and emotional angst, disappointment, fear, anxiety. The list goes on. Shame. So I'm going to encourage you to take care of yourself today or tonight, whatever time it might be. It might be morning there. But whatever time of day it is where you are, find a way that you can truly care for yourself and get real with yourself. Some way that serves you to suss out some of these stale patterns in your life that you're beginning to be ready to let go of, or maybe you're already letting them go. But choosing some form of support for yourself. And I think I named a bunch earlier in this video that might call to you. And for some, it may just be a yoga class, or cooking a good meal, or journaling, or a meditation of some kind. Somatic meditation happens to be one of my favorites because it feels like a real release, an honesty of that emotional pain that might be there, or that often is there when I need to do some somatic work. But whatever that might be for you, that helps to bring a bit more clarity around your particular relational patterns that are no longer serving you and that you're getting ready to let go of, or perhaps you're already letting them go. Have a beautiful day. Thank you.